Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Ren Blackwood and I am 24 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 months. This happened during the fall of 2024, when the missing person case of Kai Thornfield turned into something that still haunts me. I was still new to the job, still carrying that desperate need to prove I belonged in these ancient forests. Every call felt like a test I couldn't afford to fail. The other rangers were polite enough, but I caught their sideways glances when I fumbled radio protocols or took too long reading topographical maps. They remembered the last rookie who'd quit after 3 months, overwhelmed by the isolation and responsibility. October 15th started like any ordinary Tuesday. The morning fog hung thick between the Douglas firs, and the first autumn storms had stripped most of the maple leaves, leaving them in soggy piles that muffled every footstep. I was finishing my sector report when dispatch crackled through my radio at 2:47 p.m. Ranger Blackwood, we have a missing person report. Kai Thornfield, 19-year-old male, University of Washington geology student, last seen yesterday at the Hoh River trailhead. My stomach tightened. Missing persons were serious business, especially with daylight dying by 5 o'clock and temperatures dropping into the 30s. I grabbed my pack, double-checking my GPS, radio, medical kit, and emergency beacon. Everything by the book. Copy, dispatch, ETA to Hoh River trailhead 20 minutes. The drive down Highway 101 gave me time to review what I knew about Kai Thornfield. His advisor had filed the report when Kai failed to check in after his solo research trip. He was studying sediment patterns in the river system, equipped for a 3-day expedition. Experienced hiker, proper permits, good equipment, the kind of missing person case that usually ended with someone finding the hiker with a sprained ankle, embarrassed but alive. But something felt wrong from the moment I reached the trailhead parking area. Kai's Honda Civic sat alone under the towering canopy, already gathering a thin layer of fallen needles. I approached slowly, noting details the way they'd trained me. No signs of forced entry, doors locked, nothing obviously disturbed, but when I peered through the driver's side window I saw his wallet sitting on the passenger seat. Who goes into the backcountry and leaves their wallet behind? I called it in, then began examining the trail register. Kai's signature was there from October 13th, 6:30 a.m. His handwriting was neat, confident. Emergency contact, Dr. Elena Thornfield, followed by a Portland phone number. Below his entry, someone had signed in at 7:15 a.m. the same day. The signature was illegible, just a scrawled mess of letters. The Hoh River Trail stretched 18 miles into the heart of the rainforest, eventually reaching the Blue Glacier. Most day hikers turned back after the first 5 miles, but Kai's research notes indicated he planned to travel at least 10 miles upriver to collect sediment samples from specific geological formations. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, following protocol. Look for obvious signs of departure from the main path. Check for equipment drops. Note any disturbances to vegetation. The textbook knowledge felt solid in my mind, but the forest itself seemed to mock my preparation. The first 3 miles revealed nothing unusual. The trail was well maintained and Kai would have had no reason to leave it. I stopped periodically to call his name, my voice echoing off the moss-covered trees before being swallowed by the oppressive silence. No response. At mile 4 I found his first piece of equipment, a GPS unit partially buried under a pile of wet leaves just off the trail. I photographed it in place before bagging it as evidence. The device was undamaged, but the battery was dead. Could have been an accident. Equipment falls out of packs all the time. But the way it was positioned, almost deliberately hidden, sent a chill down my spine. I radioed in the discovery and continued deeper into the forest. The trail began following the river more closely, and the sound of rushing water made it harder to hear other noises. I found myself stopping frequently, straining to listen for voices, footsteps, anything that might indicate human presence. The forest felt too quiet, as if even the wildlife had abandoned this section of the park. At 4:30 p.m., with daylight already fading to a pale gray, I found Kai's backpack. It hung from a branch about 8 feet off the ground, completely intact. I stared up at it, my training warring with a growing sense of unease. According to everything I'd learned, people didn't just hang their packs in trees and wander off. Bears might drag gear around, but they don't carefully suspend it from branches. I used a fallen log to reach the pack and lowered it carefully. Inside, I found Kai's research notebooks, sample containers, food for 3 days, and a sleeping bag. Everything a geology student would need for his expedition. Everything except the student himself. Dispatch, this is Ranger Blackwood. I've located the missing person's backpack at approximately mile 5 on the Ho River Trail. Pack appears intact, no signs of animal interference. Requesting backup for expanded search. Static filled my earpiece for several seconds before dispatch responded. Copy, Ranger Blackwood. Supervisor Martinez is en route with additional personnel. Maintain position and establish a perimeter. But I couldn't just wait. Kai had been missing for over 24 hours, and with the temperature dropping, exposure was becoming a real threat. I secured the backpack and continued up the trail, marking my position every 100 yards with reflective tape. The forest grew darker and denser as I pushed deeper into the wilderness. Ancient Sitka spruces towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in daylight, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The air smelled of wet earth, decomposing leaves, and something else. Something that made my nostrils flare with instinctive alarm. At 5:15 p.m., full darkness settling over the forest, I heard the first sound that wasn't natural. A low whistle, almost like a bird call but with a distinctly human quality. It came from somewhere ahead, off to the right of the trail. I stopped, every nerve ending suddenly alert, and listened. Silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then the whistle came again, closer this time. "Kai?" I called out. "Kai Thornfield?" No response. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees in the direction of the sound. The light revealed nothing but moss-covered trunks and hanging ferns. But as I lowered the beam, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the mud beside the trail. But they weren't heading deeper into the forest. They were following the trail back toward the trailhead, following my route. I knelt beside the prints, studying them in the harsh LED light. Size 11 or 12 boots, deep treads, recent enough that water hadn't filled the impressions. Someone had been walking behind me, staying just far enough back to avoid detection. My radio crackled with static, but when I tried to respond to dispatch, I got nothing but white noise. I checked the battery, full charge. Signal strength showed 2 bars, which should have been adequate for communication, but every attempt to transmit resulted in the same interference. The whistle came again, this time from my left across the river. I spun toward the sound, flashlight beam dancing across the black water. The Ho River ran fast and deep here, far too dangerous to cross in the dark. But someone was definitely on the other side, and they were tracking my movements. Training kicked in, overriding the fear that was starting to build in my chest. Establish a defensive position, maintain communication attempts, document everything, wait for backup. I found a massive fallen cedar that provided cover and concealment about 20 yards from the trail. From this position, I could observe the path in both directions while remaining hidden. I pulled out my logbook and began recording the evening's discoveries, forcing myself to focus on concrete details rather than the growing certainty that something was very wrong. 6:03 p.m., located subject's backpack intact at mile 5 marker 6:15 p.m., discovered fresh footprints following my trail. 6:20 p.m., radio communications compromised, unknown interference. 6:22 p.m., human whistle sounds from across river, possible stalking behavior. As I wrote, I heard footsteps on the trail. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the trailhead. I clicked off my flashlight and pressed myself against the rough bark of the fallen tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my hiding place. "I know you're there, Ranger Blackwood." The voice was male, calm, with the kind of confidence that comes from complete control of a situation. My blood turned to ice water as I realized he knew my name. "You're doing good work. Very thorough, very by the book. But you're not going to find Kai Thornfield by following procedures. I remained motionless, hoping he couldn't pinpoint my exact location. My hand moved slowly toward the pepper spray on my utility belt. He's alive, you know. Hurt, scared, but alive. For now. But he's not going anywhere without help. And you're the only help coming. The footsteps resumed, moving past my position and continuing up the trail. I waited until the sounds faded before risking a look. A figure in dark clothing was barely visible about 50 yards ahead, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in the wilderness. I tried my radio again. Nothing but static. After 10 agonizing minutes, I emerged from my hiding place and began following the figure. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to wait for backup, to call for help. But if Kai was really alive and injured, every minute could be critical. And despite my inexperience, I was the only ranger currently in the field. The trail wound deeper into the forest, following the river's edge as it carved through ancient geological formations. The stranger stayed just at the edge of my flashlight range, occasionally stopping to ensure I was still following. It felt like a game, but I couldn't understand the rules. At mile 7, the trail crossed a narrow suspension bridge over a deep gorge. The wooden planks creaked ominously under my weight, and the handrails were slick with condensation. Halfway across, I realized how exposed I was. If someone wanted to trap me, this bridge would be the perfect place. But I made it across without incident and continued following the dark figure ahead. The whistle came again, but this time from behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the bridge I'd just crossed. Nothing, but the realization hit me like a physical blow. There were at least 2 people out here. One leading me forward, one watching my back. I was being herded. Ranger Blackwood. The voice came from directly ahead. I raised my flashlight and saw him clearly for the first time. Tall, probably in his 40s, wearing military-style clothing and a knit cap. His face was weathered and confident, with the kind of beard that suggested long periods in the wilderness. Most disturbing were his eyes, cold, calculating, and completely without fear. You're probably wondering what's happening here, why your radio doesn't work, why Kai's equipment was scattered along the trail, why I know your name. I found my voice. Where is Kai Thornfield? Close, very close. But first, we need to establish some ground rules. He took a step closer, and I noticed he carried no visible weapons. He didn't need them. You're going to continue following this trail for exactly 1 mile. You're going to find young Mr. Thornfield, and you're going to attempt to rescue him. And then we're going to see how good you really are at your job. Who are you? He smiled, and the expression was genuinely terrifying. Someone who knows these woods better than you ever will. Someone who used to wear that same uniform. Someone who understands that the most dangerous predator in any forest walks on 2 legs. Before I could respond, he melted back into the darkness with practiced ease. I was alone again, but the feeling of being watched remained stronger than ever. I had 2 choices: retreat to the bridge and wait for backup that might never come, or continue forward and attempt to find Kai. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but I pushed ahead up the trail. The next mile was the longest of my life. Every shadow could hide an ambush. Every sound might be the prelude to an attack. My flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the vast darkness of the old-growth forest. But I pressed on, driven by the possibility that somewhere ahead, a 19-year-old geology student was depending on me. I found him at mile 8, in a small clearing beside a tributary of the main river. Kai Thornfield was alive but in terrible condition. He sat propped against a massive Douglas fir, his left leg clearly broken and roughly splinted with branches and torn clothing. His face was pale and drawn with pain, but his eyes widened with relief when my flashlight found him. "Thank God," he whispered. I thought no one was coming." I rushed to his side, medical training taking over. His pulse was weak but steady, and while the leg injury was serious, it wasn't immediately life-threatening. Someone had done a competent job of field medicine. The splint was crude but effective. "Kai, I'm Ranger Blackwood. You're going to be okay. Can you tell me what happened? I was collecting samples yesterday morning when this guy appeared. Said he was a park volunteer, offered to help carry equipment. Seemed normal at first, but then... Kai's voice trailed off and he glanced nervously at the dark forest around us. Then what? He pushed me into the ravine, broke my leg in the fall. Then he carried me here and set the bone. Said he was sorry, but I was needed for something important. That someone would come looking for me eventually. The pieces clicked together in my mind, and the full horror of the situation became clear. I wasn't conducting a rescue mission. I was walking into a trap that had been carefully constructed using Kai as bait. The scattered equipment, the impossible positioning of his backpack, the radio interference, all of it designed to draw a lone ranger deep into the wilderness where anything could happen. "We need to move," I said, helping Kai to his feet. "Can you walk?" "I think so, with help." But as we started toward the trail, the whistle came again, this time from all around us. "Going somewhere, Ranger Blackwood?" The voice echoed through the clearing from multiple directions. I realized with growing terror that we were surrounded. The mysterious figure hadn't been alone. There were others, and they'd been watching every step of my approach. "You found him. Excellent work. But the real test starts now." I pulled out my pepper spray with one hand while supporting Kai with the other. "What do you want?" "I want to see if 8 months of training prepared you for the reality of this job. I want to see how you handle a situation that's not in any textbook." Footsteps began circling our position, staying just outside the range of my flashlight. At least 3 different sets moving with military precision. I was hopelessly outmatched and completely cut off from help. "You see, Ranger Blackwood, the Park Service used to employ someone with real wilderness skills. Someone who understood that these forests aren't just pretty hiking trails for weekend warriors. But they decided my methods were too aggressive, too unconventional." A former ranger. That explained his knowledge of protocols, his ability to sabotage communications, his intimate familiarity with the trail system. So now I conduct my own training exercises. Young Mr. Thornfield here was an opportunity to evaluate the current quality of park personnel, and you, my dear, are failing the test. The footsteps stopped and the forest fell into complete silence. "Here's how this works. You have until dawn to get your injured hiker back to the trailhead. 8 miles through terrain you barely know, carrying dead weight, with no communications and no backup. We'll be following, observing, testing your decision-making under stress. And if I refuse, then Kai Thornfield dies, and you join him. But if you succeed, if you demonstrate real competence instead of textbook theory, then you both walk away. Consider it a final exam." I stared into the darkness, trying to spot movement, trying to understand the full scope of what I was facing. But they were invisible, ghosts in their own territory. "Your time starts now, Ranger Blackwood." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat. I knew they were still there, watching, waiting for me to make the first move. Kai leaned heavily against my shoulder, his breathing shallow with pain and fear. I had to think like a ranger, not a victim. What were my assets? Medical training, basic wilderness skills, 8 months of studying these trails. A GPS unit that might still work if I could get clear of whatever was jamming communications. Emergency supplies in my pack. What were my liabilities? Injured civilian to protect. Unknown number of hostiles with superior knowledge of the terrain. No backup, no way to call for help. "Can you walk 8 miles?" I whispered to Kai. "I don't know. Maybe with help." I made the decision. We would head back down the trail, moving as quickly as Kai's condition allowed. I would use every trick I'd learned about wilderness navigation and survival, and I would pray that 8 months of training would be enough to keep us both alive until dawn. The first mile was agony. Kai tried to bear his own weight, but the broken leg made progress slow and painful. Every few minutes I heard sounds in the forest around us. A breaking branch, the crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves, the occasional whistle that let me know we were being tracked. By mile 6, Kai was barely conscious. The pain and shock were taking their toll. and I found myself half carrying him down the increasingly treacherous trail. My shoulders ached, and my legs trembled with exhaustion. But we kept moving. At mile 4, they made their first move. A tree crashed across the trail just ahead of us, missing me by inches. The massive Douglas fir blocked our path completely, forcing us to detour into the unmarked forest. I realized this was exactly what they wanted, to drive us off the established trail, where we would be even more vulnerable. "Having trouble, Ranger Blackwood?" The voice came from somewhere in the canopy above. I looked up but saw nothing except darkness. "Your boyfriend's looking a little pale. Maybe you should consider leaving him behind. Make better time on your own." I ignored the taunt and began searching for a way around the fallen tree. The trunk was too massive to climb over, and the root ball created a wall nearly 10 feet high. We would have to go around, which meant leaving the safety of the marked trail. Poor decision-making, Ranger. You're wasting valuable time. But I found what I was looking for: a game trail that skirted the root ball and reconnected with the main trail about 50 yards ahead. It was narrow and overgrown, but passable. As we struggled through the dense underbrush, I heard movement all around us. They were closing in, using our detour as an opportunity to box us in. But just as panic began to overwhelm my rational thinking, we broke through onto the main trail again. Mile 3, still 3 miles to go, and Kai was fading fast. His leg was bleeding through the makeshift splint and his skin felt cold and clammy. Signs of shock setting in. I stopped to check his vital signs and noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh boot prints in the mud ahead of us, heading toward the trailhead. They weren't just following us, they were also moving ahead to cut off our escape route. "Kai, I need you to stay conscious. Talk to me about your research. Tell me about sediment patterns." He mumbled something about glacial deposits, but his voice was weak and confused. I gave him water from my bottle and forced myself to think strategically. They were herding us toward some kind of final confrontation. The question was whether I could keep Kai alive long enough to reach help. At mile 2, they revealed their endgame. A figure stepped out of the trees directly in front of us, blocking the trail. It was the same man I'd encountered earlier, but now he carried a hunting knife in one hand and what looked like a tranquilizer gun in the other. "End of the line, Ranger Blackwood. You've done better than I expected. But this is where the real test begins." I lowered Kai to the ground as gently as possible and faced the man. "What do you want?" "I want you to make a choice. You can continue to the trailhead, but you go alone. Leave the boy here, and you walk away. Or you can stay and try to protect him, and we see how well your training prepared you for hand-to-hand combat." It wasn't really a choice at all. I couldn't abandon Kai, not after everything we'd been through, but I also knew I had no chance in a physical confrontation with someone who had military training and superior equipment. "There's a third option," I said, backing slowly toward a cluster of boulders that might provide cover. "I'm listening. You let us both go and I forget this ever happened. No reports, no investigation. You disappear back into the forest and we never see each other again." He laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "You think this is a negotiation? You think your inexperience and good intentions count for something out here?" I had reached the boulders, and I carefully positioned myself between the rocks and Kai. From this angle, I could see down the trail toward the trailhead. Less than 2 miles to safety, but it might as well have been 100. "Here's what's really going to happen, Ranger Blackwood. You're going to learn that the wilderness doesn't care about your procedures or your training or your noble intentions. You're going to learn that when you're truly alone, when there's no backup coming and no manual to follow, you find out what you're really made of." He raised the tranquilizer gun, and I knew I had seconds to act. I grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it at his head with all the strength I had left. He dodged easily, but the movement gave me the opening I needed. I lunged forward and tackled him around the waist, driving us both to the ground. We rolled in the mud and fallen leaves, fighting for control of the weapons. He was stronger and more experienced, but desperation gave me an edge he hadn't expected. I managed to knock the tranquilizer gun out of his hand, and it clattered away into the darkness. The knife was still in play, and he slashed at me with practiced efficiency. The blade caught my jacket, slicing through the fabric and barely missing my ribs. I grabbed his wrist with both hands, trying to control the weapon. For a moment, we were locked in a deadly stalemate. He was trying to drive the knife toward my throat while I fought to keep the blade away from anything vital. His face was inches from mine, and I could see the cold calculation in his eyes. "You're going to die here, Ranger. You're going to die because you weren't good enough, and that boy is going to die because you couldn't protect him." But he made one crucial mistake. He assumed that 8 months of training hadn't taught me anything about violence. What he didn't know was that I'd grown up with 3 older brothers who'd taught me that. Sometimes you have to fight dirty to survive. I drove my knee up into his groin with everything I had left. He gasped and loosened his grip on the knife just enough for me to twist the blade away from my body. Before he could recover, I rolled away and scrambled to my feet. The knife was still in his hand, but he was doubled over in pain. I had maybe seconds before he recovered and came after me again. I looked around desperately for any advantage, any weapon, any escape route. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distant hum of an ATV engine. Backup was finally coming. The man heard it too, and his expression changed from confidence to alarm. Whatever game he'd been playing, it was about to be interrupted by the arrival of other park personnel. "This isn't over, Ranger Blackwood. You got lucky tonight, but luck runs out eventually." He melted back into the forest with the same practiced ease he'd shown earlier, disappearing completely in the space of a few seconds. I was alone with Kai, who was unconscious, but still breathing. The ATV headlights appeared around a bend in the trail, and I nearly collapsed with relief. Supervisor Martinez jumped off the vehicle before it had completely stopped, followed by 2 EMTs with a portable stretcher. "Blackwood, what the hell happened out here? Your radio's been dead for hours." I tried to explain while the medics worked on Kai, but the words came out in a confused jumble. Radio interference, scattered equipment, a former ranger with a grudge, a psychological game that had nearly turned deadly. Martinez listened with growing concern, occasionally asking questions that I couldn't answer. How many attackers? What did they look like? Did I get a clear look at their faces? The truth was, I had very little concrete evidence of what had happened. No photographs of the suspects. No physical evidence beyond the equipment we'd recovered. Just the word of a rookie ranger who'd been through a traumatic experience. By the time we reached the trailhead, Kai was stable but still unconscious. The EMTs loaded him into an ambulance for transport to the regional hospital. Martinez stayed behind to take my official statement and coordinate a search of the area. But we found nothing. No footprints that couldn't be explained. No equipment or weapons left behind. No trace of the people who had turned a routine missing person case into a nightmare. The official report listed the incident as a missing hiker case with suspicious circumstances. Kai's injuries were attributed to an accidental fall, possibly complicated by exposure and delirium. My account of the confrontation was noted, but couldn't be corroborated. Kai recovered fully from his injuries, but he had no memory of the events after his fall into the ravine. The doctors attributed this to head trauma and shock. He remembered meeting someone who claimed to be a park volunteer, but he couldn't provide a detailed description. I stayed on as a ranger, but something fundamental had changed. I no longer trusted the forest in the same way. Every solo patrol felt like a potential trap. Every missing person case brought back memories of that October night when I learned that the most dangerous predator in any wilderness is often another human being. 3 months later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a hiker who had gone missing in North Cascades National Park. A geology student from the University of Washington. The article mentioned that the missing person's equipment had been found scattered along a remote trail, and that radio communications with the search team had been mysteriously disrupted. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written a single line in neat handwriting. "Better luck next time, Ranger Blackwood." I never reported the letter. What would be the point? But I keep it in my desk drawer as a reminder that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness I've sworn to protect, someone is still playing games. Someone who knows my name, knows my weaknesses, and is patient enough to wait for another opportunity to test my skills. The forest is full of predators, but none of them are as dangerous as the ones that think like we do. Some nights, when I'm alone on patrol, I still hear whistles in the dark, and I know that someday, when I'm least prepared for it, the test will begin again. My name is Marlo Kestrel and I'm 26 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 months. This happened during the fall of 2023 when the missing person case of Ainsley Thorne turned into something that still haunts me. I was still new to the job, only 8 months in, when the call came through on that gray October evening. The radio crackled to life at 4:47 p.m., just as the early autumn darkness was beginning to settle over the temperate rainforest like a heavy blanket. Unit 47, we have a missing hiker report, 24 hours overdue. I grabbed my radio, fingers slightly trembling, not from cold, but from the familiar spike of adrenaline that came with these calls. Even after 8 months, I still felt that desperate need to prove myself, to show that hiring me hadn't been a mistake. Unit 47 responding. Details? Ainsley Thorne, 19 years old, solo hiker, photography student from University of Washington. Last seen on Hoh River Trail yesterday morning around 0800 hours. Vehicle still in trailhead parking. Family called it in when she missed her evening check-in. I scribbled the details on my notepad, my handwriting barely legible in the dim light of my patrol vehicle. Ainsley Thorne, 19. The same age I'd been when I'd first fallen in love with these ancient forests during a college backpacking trip. That personal connection hit me immediately, maybe too hard. Copy that. ETA to trailhead 15 minutes. The drive through the winding park roads felt longer than usual. Towering Douglas firs and western red cedars pressed close to the asphalt, their massive trunks disappearing into the fog that had rolled in from the Pacific. October in Olympic was always moody, but tonight felt different. The usual sounds of the forest, wind through branches, distant bird calls, the whisper of falling leaves, seemed muted, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. I'd been on 12 missing person cases since starting the job. 11 had ended well. Lost day hikers who'd wandered off trail, inexperienced campers who'd simply gotten turned around, one elderly man with early-stage dementia who'd walked 3 miles in the wrong direction before sitting down to wait for help. But there had been one case, my second month on the job, where we'd found the hiker 3 days too late, hypothermic and alone, curled beneath a fallen log like he was sleeping. That failure still ate at me. Every ranger had one. This couldn't be my second. The Hoh River trailhead parking area was nearly empty when I arrived. Just Ainsley's silver Honda Civic sitting under the park information kiosk. I pulled on my headlamp and approached the vehicle, the beam cutting through the gathering dusk. The car was locked, no signs of disturbance. Through the windows, I could see a camera bag on the passenger seat, some energy bars on the dashboard, a coffee cup in the holder. Normal stuff. Stuff that suggested she'd planned to come back. I keyed my radio. Base Unit 47 on scene. Vehicle confirmed. Beginning preliminary search of immediate area. Copy 47. Supervisor Chen en route with additional resources. ETA 45 minutes. 45 minutes. In the growing darkness of an October evening, that felt like forever. But I couldn't wait. Not with a 19-year-old girl potentially injured somewhere in the forest. I had my emergency pack, my GPS, my radio. I knew the procedures. More importantly, I needed to prove I could handle this. The Hoh River Trail was one of the park's most popular routes, a relatively easy walk through old-growth temperate rainforest that led deeper into the Olympic wilderness. During summer, hundreds of hikers used it daily. But in late October, with rain and early darkness, most visitors stuck to shorter, safer trails. I started down the main trail, sweeping my headlamp beam back and forth, looking for any sign that Ainsley had deviated from the marked path. The trail was soft with fallen leaves, maple, alder, and Douglas fir needles that created a thick carpet underfoot. Every step seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. About half a mile in, I found the first sign. A piece of bright yellow fabric hung from a salmonberry bush about 10 feet off the main trail. I approached carefully, using my flashlight to examine it without disturbing the scene. It was synthetic material, the kind used in high-end hiking gear. Fresh, too. The edges weren't weathered, and there was no moss or debris accumulated on it. I photographed the fabric with my phone and noted the GPS coordinates. Standard procedure. But as I stood there in the circle of my headlamp's glow, I felt something else. a prickling sensation between my shoulder blades like I was being watched. I turned slowly, sweeping my light in a full circle. Nothing but trees and shadows and the sound of my own breathing, which had become heavier without me realizing it. The fog was thickening, reducing my visibility to maybe 20 feet in any direction. Probably just nerves, I whispered to myself, a habit I'd developed during solo patrols. First real case. Don't screw it up. I followed the direction the fabric suggested, pushing through the underbrush. The forest floor here was softer, more yielding, perfect for holding tracks. And there they were, boot prints in the muddy soil, heading roughly northeast toward one of the many unnamed creeks that fed into the Ho River. The prints were small, consistent with a 19-year-old woman. But there was something odd about them. They were deep. Too deep for someone Ainsley's size unless she was carrying much more weight than a day hiker should have. And the spacing was irregular, sometimes the normal walking pace, other times longer strides as if she'd been running. I followed the tracks for another 100 yards before my radio crackled. Unit 47, this is Supervisor Chen. What's your status? Found evidence, Supervisor. Yellow fabric, possibly from victim's gear, and tracks leading northeast off Main Trail approximately 0.7 miles from trailhead. Copy that. Stay with the trail, Kestrel. Don't go off route alone. We're setting up command at the trailhead. I stared down at the tracks disappearing into the gloom ahead of me. Every minute that passed reduced Ainsley's chances if she was injured, if she was suffering from hypothermia, if she'd fallen and couldn't move, if she was lost and panicking. Every minute mattered. But Chen was right. Protocol said to wait for backup. Copy, Supervisor. Marking location and returning to... The scream cut through the forest like a blade. High-pitched, terrified, unmistakably human. And it came from the direction the tracks were leading. I keyed my radio immediately. Base, Unit 47. Heard what sounded like a human scream, northeast of my position. Pursuing immediately. Negative 47. Wait for... I switched off my radio and ran. The tracks led down a steep embankment toward the sound of running water. I half slid, half stumbled down the slope, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly as I tried to keep the boot prints in sight. Branches whipped at my face, and the smell of rich, dark earth and decomposing leaves filled my nostrils. At the bottom of the embankment, I found myself beside a narrow creek, maybe 8 feet wide, running dark and fast over moss-covered rocks. The boot prints continued along the creek bank, but they were joined now by something else that made my blood turn cold. Larger boot prints. Much larger. The tread pattern was different too. Deeper, more aggressive, like military or tactical boots. And they seemed to be following Ainsley's trail. Shit, I whispered, then immediately felt guilty for the language. Chen was always reminding us that we represented the National Park Service, even when alone in the wilderness. I followed both sets of tracks along the creek bank, moving as quietly as I could. The sound of running water helped mask my footsteps, but it also meant I couldn't hear much else. Every shadow beyond my headlamp beam could hide anything, or anyone. After about 10 minutes of careful tracking, I saw the light. It was orange and flickering, clearly a fire, coming from what looked like a small clearing about 50 yards ahead. I switched off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The fire was definitely there, and I could make out at least one figure moving around it. I crept closer, using the massive trunks of old-growth cedars for cover. As I got within 30 yards, I could hear voices. A woman's voice, high with fear, and a man's voice, low and calm in a way that somehow made it more frightening. "Please," the woman was saying. "Please, I don't understand what you want. I have money in my car, credit cards." "Money?" The man's voice carried a hint of amusement. "You think this is about money, sweetheart?" I was close enough now to see them clearly. A young woman with dark hair, definitely matching Ainsley's description, sat tied to a tree at the edge of the firelight. Across from her, with his back to me, was a large man in dark clothing. Even from behind, something about his posture, his movements seemed familiar. "Then what?" Ainsley's voice was shaking. "What do you want?" The man stood up slowly and turned slightly, giving me a partial view of his profile. My stomach dropped. Cade Brennan. I knew that face from the employee briefings, from the hushed conversations among the veteran rangers. Cade Brennan had been dismissed from the Park Service 3 years ago after multiple complaints about inappropriate conduct with female hikers. The official story was that he'd been harassing women on the trails, using his authority as a ranger to intimidate them. But there had been whispers of worse things: missing equipment, false reports, long, unexplained absences from his assigned patrol areas. "What I want," Brennan said, walking closer to Ainsley, "is to see how long it takes them to find you, how good their new rangers really are." He gestured toward the darkness beyond the fire. "Matter of fact, one of them should be along any minute now." My blood turned to ice water. He knew I was coming. Somehow he'd known I would follow the trail. Brennan continued talking, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "See, I spent 15 years learning every inch of this forest. Every trail, every creek, every cave, every hiding spot. I know where the radio signals are weak, where the GPS gets confused by the canopy, where a man can disappear completely if he knows what he's doing." I fumbled for my radio, trying to call for backup, but when I keyed the microphone, all I got was static. He was right about the signal. "And I know," Brennan went on, "that the new rangers are all young and eager and desperate to prove themselves, especially the girl rangers. They'll take risks the veterans won't take. They'll come alone." Ainsley was crying now, soft sobs that tore at my heart. But I had to think tactically. I was alone, with no radio contact, facing a man who knew these woods better than I did, and who clearly had experience with whatever sick game he was playing. I had my service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock, but Brennan likely had weapons too, and he had the advantage of position and preparation. But I also had one thing he might not expect. I was smarter than he thought. 8 months might make me a rookie, but I'd graduated top of my academy class, and I'd spent every free moment since starting the job studying the park maps, learning the terrain. I might not know every hiding spot, but I knew the major landmarks, the evacuation routes, the places where radio coverage was better. I started backing away from the clearing, moving as quietly as possible. If I could get to higher ground, maybe a quarter-mile north, I knew there was a spot where I could get radio contact. I could call in cavalry, Chen and the search team, maybe even state police if this was as bad as it seemed. I'd made it maybe 20 yards when I heard Brennan's voice again, but this time he wasn't talking to Ainsley. "You can stop sneaking around out there, Ranger Kestrel. I know you're here." I froze, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would give away my position. "Come on into the light," Brennan called. "Let's have a chat, just you, me, and little Ainsley here. I promise I won't hurt her if you cooperate." Every instinct told me to run, get help, come back with backup and proper equipment. But Ainsley's terrified sobs carried clearly through the night air, and I knew that leaving her alone with this psychopath wasn't an option. If he was willing to hurt her anyway, my presence might be the only thing keeping her alive. I stepped into the clearing, my hand resting on my weapon but not drawing it yet. Brennan smiled when he saw me, and it was one of the most chilling expressions I'd ever seen. He was a big man, probably 6'3" and solidly built, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore dark tactical clothing and had a large knife on his belt. "Marlo Kestrel," he said, like we were old friends. 8 months on the job, University of Washington Forestry Program. Graduated summa cum laude. Parents live in Bellingham. Currently dating nobody, living alone in that little apartment on Marine Drive in Sequim. The fact that he knew so much about me was more terrifying than any weapon he might have carried. "Let her go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "This is between you and the Park Service. She's just a college kid." "Just a college kid," Brennan repeated, walking slowly around the fire. "You know what's funny about you new rangers? You still think this job is about helping people, protecting the wilderness, being some kind of hero." He stopped directly across the fire from me, the flames dancing between us. "But the truth is, Marlo—" "Can I call you Marlo? The truth is that this job is about power, life and death decisions. and most of you are too weak to handle that kind of responsibility. I could see Ainsley clearly now in the firelight. She was definitely the girl from the photos. Dark hair, small build, college-aged. Her wrists were bound with what looked like climbing rope, and she had a cut on her forehead that had bled down into her right eye. But she was conscious and alert, which meant she wasn't seriously injured yet. "What do you want, Brennan?" I asked. His smile widened. "I want to see what you're made of. See if you're stronger than the others." "Others? You didn't think little Ainsley here was the first, did you?" He gestured casually toward the girl. "There have been 6 others over the past 3 years, all found eventually, of course. Some in better shape than others." The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. 6 other people, 6 other missing person cases that I probably remembered from the briefings, cases where hikers had been found days later, traumatized and sometimes injured, with stories about getting lost or falling that never quite added up. "You're insane," I whispered. "I'm a predator," Brennan corrected. "Just like the wolves and the bears and the mountain lions. The difference is, I'm smart enough to make it a game." He started walking toward me slowly, keeping the fire between us for now. "Here's how it works, Marlowe. You and I are going to play a little game of hide-and-seek in these woods. You get a 10-minute head start. If you can evade me until dawn, that's about 8 hours. Then you and Ainsley both go free. If I catch you," he shrugged. "Well, let's just say that won't end well for either of you." "And if I refuse to play?" Brennan's expression didn't change, but he pulled the knife from his belt. It was a large tactical blade, the kind military personnel carried. "Then I kill her right now and hunt you anyway. At least this way she has a chance." I looked at Ainsley, who was staring at me with desperate hope in her eyes. She was counting on me to save her, to be the competent park ranger who knew what to do in any emergency. But the truth was, I had no idea what to do. My training hadn't prepared me for anything like this. 10 minutes, I said finally. Brennan nodded approvingly. "Good choice. And Marlowe? Don't even think about trying to get help. I've got motion sensors on all the main trails between here and the trailhead. If you head toward civilization instead of playing the game, Ainsley dies. Understood?" I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. "Your time starts now." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a panicked animal, my headlamp beam sweeping wildly as I tried to put distance between myself and the clearing. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened and figure out some kind of plan. Brennan was ex-military. I remembered that from his personnel file. Special forces, with experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. He knew tactics, weapons, survival skills. He'd been planning this for 3 years, using his intimate knowledge of the park to hunt people for sport. But he'd made one mistake. He'd assumed I would panic, would run blindly through the forest until he caught me. He thought I was just another inexperienced rookie who would crack under pressure. After about 5 minutes of hard running, I stopped and forced myself to think tactically. I was in a section of the forest I knew reasonably well, about 2 miles northeast of the Hoh River Trail, in terrain that was mostly old-growth timber, with occasional clearings and creek crossings. The nearest major landmark was Mount Tom Creek, which ran roughly east-west and eventually joined the Hoh River. If I could reach Mount Tom Creek, I could follow it upstream to the higher elevations where my radio might work. But that was at least 3 miles through difficult terrain, and Brennan would expect me to head for higher ground. Instead, I decided to do something he might not anticipate. I doubled back. Moving as quietly as possible, I started working my way back toward the area where I'd first found Ainsley's tracks. Not to the clearing where Brennan was holding her, I wasn't suicidal, but to the creek bank where I'd seen his boot prints. If Brennan had been using this area as a hunting ground for 3 years, he might have a base camp somewhere nearby. Supply caches, equipment, maybe even vehicles. And if I could find evidence of his operation, I might be able to turn the tables on him. It took me 20 minutes of careful movement to reach the creek bank. I'd turned off my headlamp and was navigating by moonlight filtered through the forest canopy, which meant moving slowly and feeling my way past obstacles. But it also meant I was much harder to spot. I followed the creek downstream, away from Brennan's fire, looking for any signs of disturbance. The boot tracks I'd found earlier continued along the bank for about 100 yards before disappearing into the stream itself. But on the far side of the creek, I found something interesting. A game trail, barely visible, probably used by deer and elk, that had been recently widened. Branches had been cut, and there were more boot prints in the soft earth. This wasn't natural animal movement. This was a deliberately maintained path. I crossed the creek as quietly as possible, wincing as the ice-cold water filled my boots. The game trail led uphill through a dense stand of second-growth timber, the kind of forest that had been logged decades ago and had grown back thick and tangled. After about 10 minutes of following the trail, I smelled smoke. Not fresh wood smoke from an active fire, but the lingering smell of many fires, the kind of odor that soaks into clothes and equipment over time. I moved even more carefully now, checking each step before putting my weight down. Ahead, through the trees, I could see a structure of some kind. Too regular to be natural, but not large enough to be a building. It was a lean-to shelter, expertly constructed from local materials and positioned in a small clearing that was invisible from any direction except the game trail I'd followed. And it was clearly occupied. Military-style equipment was arranged with obsessive neatness: sleeping bag, camping stove, water purification tablets, first aid kit, and several firearms, including what looked like a military-style rifle. There were also items that made my stomach turn: zip ties, duct tape, a collection of driver's licenses and park permits that probably belonged to previous victims. But the most disturbing discovery was a detailed map of Olympic National Park that had been marked with red pins. At least 20 pins scattered across different areas of the park, with dates written beside them in small, precise handwriting. I couldn't read all the dates in the poor light, but I could see enough to confirm what Brennan had told me. This had been going on for years. I used my phone to take pictures of everything, though I doubted the images would be much use in the darkness. But if I survived this, there would need to be evidence. As I was photographing the map, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze: footsteps on the game trail below. I'd been so focused on documenting Brennan's camp that I'd lost track of time. My 10-minute head start was long over, and he was hunting me. I grabbed one of the zip ties from his supply pile, evidence, but also potentially useful, and started moving away from the shelter as quickly and quietly as possible. The smart thing would be to get as far from his base camp as possible. But there was a problem. This clearing was on high ground, and from here I could see the distant glow of his fire where he'd left Ainsley. If I ran now, I'd be abandoning her to a psychopath, but if I stayed, I'd be trapped between Brennan and his well-supplied base camp. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear him moving through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew every root and rock. In a few minutes, he'd reach the clearing and realize I'd found his camp. I made a decision that was either brilliant or incredibly stupid. I hid. There was a massive fallen cedar near the edge of the clearing, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. Decades of decay had created a hollow space beneath it, large enough for a person to crawl into. I squeezed into the space, ignoring the musty smell of rotting wood and the feeling of insects crawling over my hands. From my hiding spot, I could see most of the clearing and Brennan's lean-to shelter. I also had a clear view of the game trail he would use to approach. I didn't have to wait long. Brennan emerged from the tree line, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. But when he saw his disturbed campsite, he stopped dead. "Clever girl," he said, loud enough for me to hear. "Very clever." He walked to the shelter and quickly inventoried his supplies, immediately spotting what I'd taken. He held up the zip ties, examining them in the moonlight. "You know what this means, don't you, Marlowe?" His voice was calm, conversational, as if we were having a chat over coffee. "This means you're not running scared. This means you're thinking tactically. I'm impressed." He set down the zip ties and picked up the rifle. "But it also means the game just got more interesting. You see, I was planning to make this easy on you. A simple chase through the forest, maybe let you think you had a chance of escaping, but now I see you're going to be more challenging prey." He slung the rifle over his shoulder and started examining the ground around the shelter, looking for signs of which direction I'd gone. The thing about being predator and prey, he continued, still talking as if I were standing right next to him, is that it's all about understanding behavior. Prey animals run in predictable patterns. They head for water or high ground, or toward other members of their species. But intelligent prey, human prey, can be much more unpredictable. He found the trail I'd left heading away from the clearing and started following it. But he moved slowly, carefully, checking for traps or ambushes. You could be anywhere out there, Marlowe. You could be running toward help, or you could be circling back to try to free little Ainsley. You could be setting up an ambush, or you could be hiding somewhere hoping I'll give up and go away. He was about 20 yards from my hiding spot now, following my trail. In a few more steps, he'd realized the tracks stopped at the fallen cedar. But here's what I know about you, Brennan said, getting closer. You're young and idealistic, and you still believe in doing the right thing, which means you won't abandon that girl. Sooner or later, you'll try to be a hero. He stopped right next to the fallen cedar. If he looked down, he'd see me for sure. And when you do, I'll be waiting. For a long moment, he stood there in complete silence. I held my breath, pressing my face into the rotting wood, trying to become invisible. Finally, he started moving again, following my false trail away from the clearing. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore before crawling out of my hiding place. My hands were shaking, and I realized I'd been holding my breath so long I was lightheaded. But I'd learned something important. Brennan was overconfident. He assumed he knew how I'd behave, and that arrogance might be his weakness. He'd also left his base camp unguarded, and while I couldn't carry the rifle, too conspicuous, there were other things I could use. I grabbed a handful of zip ties, a roll of duct tape, and a small camping knife from his supplies. I also took one of the driver's licenses from his collection. A young woman named Jessica Torres, who'd gone missing 2 years ago and had been found 3 days later, claiming she'd gotten lost. Evidence that Brennan had been doing this for years. More importantly, I now knew where his base camp was, and I had a better understanding of the terrain. The game trail that led to his shelter continued past the clearing, heading generally northeast toward the higher elevations. If I followed it, I might be able to reach an area where my radio would work. But first, I had to do something about Ainsley. The problem was that Brennan expected me to try to rescue her. He'd probably set traps around the clearing, or positioned himself where he could watch for my approach. A direct assault would be suicide, but there might be another way. I'd noticed something when I was photographed his map. Several of the red pins were clustered around water sources, the Hoh River, Mount Tom Creek, and a few smaller streams. If Brennan had been using these areas as hunting grounds for years, he probably knew every water source in this part of the park, which meant he'd expect me to avoid water, since crossing streams left obvious tracks and limited escape routes. Instead, I decided to use the water. Mount Tom Creek was about a mile northwest of Brennan's base camp, and it flowed generally southwest toward the Hoh River. If I could reach the creek without being detected, I could follow it downstream toward the area where he was holding Ainsley. The sound of running water would mask my movement, and I could approach his position from an unexpected direction. It was risky. If he caught me in the creek, I'd have nowhere to run. But it was also the kind of unconventional thinking that might give me an advantage over someone who assumed he knew how I'd behave. I started moving northwest, using the game trail until it veered too far east, then striking out cross-country through the forest. Without a trail to follow, the going was much slower. Every step required careful placement to avoid snapping branches or rustling through dry leaves. The forest floor was an obstacle course of fallen logs, hidden root systems, and sudden drop-offs. After about 30 minutes of careful movement, I heard the sound of running water ahead. Mount Tom Creek was larger than the stream where I'd first found tracks, maybe 15 feet wide and running fast over a rocky bottom. In the moonlight, I could see white water where it flowed over small rapids. I waded into the creek, gasping as the ice-cold water reached my knees. The current was stronger than I'd expected, and the rocky bottom was slippery with moss and algae. but I managed to find my footing and started working my way downstream. Following the creek was like traveling through a different world. The forest canopy opened up over the water, allowing more moonlight to filter through. I could see farther in both directions, but I was also more visible if anyone was watching. The sound of the water was both blessing and curse. It covered the noise of my movement, but it also meant I couldn't hear if anyone was approaching. After about 20 minutes of creek walking, I started seeing the orange glow of Brennan's fire through the trees ahead. I was approaching the clearing from the south, the opposite direction from where I'd originally discovered them. I moved as close as I dared, using the creek bank vegetation for cover. From about 50 yards away, I could see the clearing clearly. Ainsley was still tied to the tree, but now she appeared to be unconscious or asleep. The fire had burned down to mostly coals, providing less light but also creating more shadows. And there was no sign of Brennan. This was either a perfect opportunity or a perfect trap. I spent several minutes watching the clearing, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that Brennan was hidden nearby, waiting for me to make a move. But everything was still. Finally, I decided I had to risk it. If Ainsley was injured or going into shock, every minute mattered. I left the creek and started working my way toward the clearing, moving from tree to tree, pausing at each bit of cover to scan for threats. The forest was absolutely silent except for my own heartbeat, which seemed loud enough to wake the dead. I was about 20 yards from Ainsley when I realized something was wrong. She was too still. Even unconscious people moved slightly when they breathed, shifted position occasionally, but Ainsley wasn't moving at all. I got closer, dread building in my stomach. In the dim light from the dying fire, I could see her face. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead with the fixed gaze of the dead. I'd failed. While I was playing hide-and-seek in the forest, Brennan had killed her. I approached the tree where she was tied, fighting down the nausea and guilt that threatened to overwhelm me. But as I got closer, I realized something even more disturbing. It wasn't Ainsley. The face was similar. Young woman, dark hair, college-aged. But this was someone else. Someone who'd been dead for hours, maybe days, based on the smell that was just starting to reach me. It was a trap. Brennan had moved Ainsley and replaced her with one of his previous victims, counting on my emotional response to draw me into the open. And it had worked perfectly. "Hello, Marlowe." The voice came from directly behind me. I spun around to find Brennan standing at the edge of the clearing, the rifle pointed casually in my direction. "You're even more predictable than I thought," he said, walking slowly toward me. "Young rangers always try to be heroes, always think they can save everyone." I backed away from him, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing was maybe 30 yards across, and he was between me and the main escape routes. "Where's Ainsley?" I demanded. "Safe," Brennan said. "For now. Though that might change depending on how cooperative you are." He gestured toward the dead woman tied to the tree. "Meet Jessica Torres. You might remember her case from a couple years ago. Missing hiker, found 3 days later with a story about getting lost. Except that wasn't the whole truth, was it, Jessica?" The fact that he was talking to a corpse was somehow more terrifying than anything else he'd done. "Jessica was my first real success," Brennan continued. "Took me a while to perfect the technique. The psychological pressure, the fear, the hope followed by despair. It's an art form, really." "You're insane," I said, still backing away from him. "I'm evolved," Brennan corrected. "Most people go their entire lives without understanding what they're truly capable of, without pushing themselves to their absolute limits. But extreme situations reveal extreme truths." He was close enough now that I could see his eyes in the firelight. They were completely calm, which was more frightening than any expression of rage or madness would have been. "So here's what's going to happen, Marlowe. You're going to drop that knife you took from my camp. Yes, I noticed it was missing. And you're going to put your hands where I can see them. Then we're going to take a little walk, and I'm going to show you what 3 years of planning can accomplish." I could feel the small camping knife in my jacket pocket, but it wouldn't be much use against a rifle. Still, I wasn't ready to give up completely. "And if I refuse?" "Then Ainsley dies very slowly, and you get to listen to every scream. The casual way he said it made my blood turn to ice. This wasn't someone who could be reasoned with or appealed to. This was a predator in the truest sense. Someone who viewed other people as prey animals to be hunted for sport. I pulled the knife from my pocket and dropped it on the ground. "Good choice," Brennan said. "Now let's go see what you're really made of." He gestured toward the tree line with the rifle barrel. "That way. There's a trail about 50 yards into the forest. Stay on it and don't try anything clever. I've got motion sensors and tripwires set up along all the escape routes." As we walked into the forest, Brennan kept talking, his voice calm and conversational. "You know what the problem is with modern society, Marlowe. We've eliminated all the real challenges. Food comes from grocery stores. Water comes from faucets. Shelter is just a matter of paying rent. People go their entire lives without ever being truly tested." The trail he directed me onto was another game path, but this one had been more extensively modified. Branches had been cut back to create clear sight lines, and I could see small reflective markers attached to trees at regular intervals, the kind hunters use to mark paths in low light. "But out here," Brennan continued, "in the real wilderness, people discover what they're actually made of. Strip away the civilization, the safety nets, the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, and you find out who's predator and who's prey." We walked for about 10 minutes before the trail opened into another clearing, this one larger than where he'd held the decoy. And what I saw there made me understand the true scope of what Brennan had been doing. It was a compound of sorts. 3 different shelters arranged around a central fire pit with equipment caches, storage areas, and what looked like holding pens constructed from heavy timber and chain-link fencing. This wasn't the improvised camp of a deranged individual. This was a sophisticated operation that had been planned and constructed over years. "Welcome to my laboratory," Brennan said with obvious pride. 3 years of planning, 2 years of construction, every board carried in on foot, every tool selected for maximum utility and minimum weight. Do you have any idea how much work goes into building something like this in a location that's completely off the grid? In one of the holding areas, I could see a figure huddled in the corner. Even in the poor light, I could tell it was Ainsley, alive, conscious, and watching our approach with desperate eyes. "The beautiful thing about this location," Brennan continued, directing me toward the central fire pit, "is that it's completely invisible from any official trail. No GPS coordinates, no survey markers, no record that it even exists. I could keep people here for weeks without anyone finding them." He gestured for me to sit on a log that had been positioned like a bench near the fire pit. "Sit down, Marlowe. We need to have a conversation about your future." I sat, my mind racing. The compound was clearly the result of extensive planning and preparation. The holding areas were escape-proof, the shelters were weatherproof, and everything was positioned to give Brennan maximum control over anyone he brought here. But it was also isolated, which meant he was just as cut off from help as I was. And despite all his preparation, he was still just one man. "Here's what's going to happen," Brennan said, settling onto another log across the fire pit from me. The rifle remained pointed in my general direction, but casually, as if he was completely confident in his control of the situation. "You and Ainsley are going to be my guests for the next few days. Think of it as an intensive training course in survival psychology. You'll face challenges designed to test your limits, physical, mental, emotional. Some of you will rise to the occasion. Others will break." He stoked the fire with a metal rod, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. The ones who break become teaching aids for future students. The ones who demonstrate real potential get to walk away with a new understanding of what they're capable of. "And how many have walked away?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Brennan's smile was cold. "You'd be surprised, more than you might think, but fewer than I'd hoped." The implication was clear. Most of his students didn't survive their training. "But you, Marlowe," he continued, "you've already shown more promise than most. Finding my base camp, evading capture for as long as you did, thinking tactically instead of just running in panic. You have potential." "Potential for what?" "To become what you were meant to be, a real predator instead of a pretend protector. The suggestion was so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that it took me a moment to process what he was actually proposing. You want me to become like you? I want you to become yourself. Your real self, not the weak, civilized version that society has trained you to be. He stood up and walked over to one of the equipment caches, returning with a large hunting knife that he placed on the ground between us. Here's your first test, Marlowe. Simple choice. You can take that knife and kill Ainsley, quickly, mercifully, and I'll let you walk out of here. You'll be free to go back to your little ranger job, your comfortable apartment, your safe, meaningless life. I stared at the knife, horrified by what he was suggesting. Or, Brennan continued, you can refuse, and I'll keep both of you here for as long as it takes to break you completely. Days, weeks, maybe months, and when I'm finished, you'll beg me to let you kill her, just to make the pain stop. There's a third option, I said quietly. Is there? I kill you instead. Brennan laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. With what? You're unarmed, I'm holding a rifle, and you're sitting in the middle of my compound surrounded by traps and obstacles I've spent years perfecting. He was right, of course. Even if I could somehow get my hands on the knife, he'd shoot me before I could get close to him. And even if I could somehow overpower him, I had no idea how to navigate out of this place in the dark. But there was something he didn't know. I'd been listening carefully to everything he'd said, and I'd noticed something important. He kept talking about breaking people, about psychological pressure and fear. This wasn't just about killing. It was about the process, the psychological torture that came before the physical violence, which meant he needed me alive, at least for now. And that gave me time to think. I need a minute to consider, I said. Take all the time you want, Brennan replied. But remember, every minute you delay is another minute that Ainsley suffers. From the holding area, I could hear Ainsley crying quietly. The sound was heart-wrenching, but it also told me something important. She was still conscious, still alert. If I could find a way to get her free, she might be able to help. I looked around the compound more carefully, trying to memorize the layout. 3 shelters, multiple equipment caches, the holding areas, and various other structures I couldn't identify in the darkness. But I also noticed something else. Tripwires. Brennan had mentioned having the escape routes booby-trapped, and now I could see thin lines stretched between trees at ankle height around the perimeter of the compound. They were almost invisible in the poor light, but they were there. The question was, were they designed to keep people in, or to alert Brennan if someone tried to approach from outside? Time's up, Marlowe, Brennan said. What's it going to be? I stood up slowly, my hand moving toward the knife on the ground. Brennan's grip on the rifle tightened slightly, but he didn't raise it. He was confident that I was going to make the choice he wanted. Instead, I kicked dirt from the fire pit onto the blade, then grabbed a burning branch from the fire and threw it as hard as I could at the nearest shelter. The shelter's roof was made of dry cedar bark and pine boughs. It caught fire immediately, sending flames shooting up into the night sky. Brennan cursed and swung the rifle toward me, but I was already moving, diving toward the equipment cache he'd taken the knife from. The wooden crate was heavy enough to provide some cover, and it contained enough gear that I might find something useful. The rifle shot echoed through the forest like thunder, and I felt splinters explode from the crate inches from my head. But I'd reached cover, and Brennan couldn't get a clear shot without exposing himself to the growing fire. "You stupid bitch," he shouted. "You have no idea what you've done." But I did know. The fire was spreading quickly and smoke was billowing up into the night sky. If there was anyone else in the forest, other rangers, search and rescue teams, even aircraft, they'd see the glow and come to investigate. More importantly, the fire was destroying Brennan's carefully constructed compound. Years of planning and preparation were going up in smoke, and he was more concerned about saving his equipment than maintaining control of his prisoners. I rummaged through the equipment cache, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. Most of it was camping gear, rope, tarps, cooking equipment, but at the bottom of the crate I found something useful, a flare gun. Brennan was moving around the compound now, trying to salvage what he could from the spreading fire. The second shelter had caught fire, and the flames were jumping from tree to tree. In a few minutes, this whole area would be an inferno. I loaded a flare into the gun and fired it straight up into the night sky. The bright red light arced high above the forest canopy before beginning its slow descent on a parachute. If anyone was looking for us, they'd see that signal for miles. "Ainsley!" I shouted over the roar of the flames. "Can you hear me?" "I'm here." Her voice was weak but clear. "I can't get free." The holding area where she was confined was on the far side of the compound, past 2 burning shelters and across Brennan's direct line of sight. But the fire was creating enough smoke and confusion that I might be able to reach her. I started moving, staying low, and using the equipment caches and storage areas for cover. Brennan was somewhere in the smoke, but I couldn't see him clearly. Occasionally I'd hear him cursing or moving equipment, but the fire was so loud now that it was hard to pinpoint his location. I was halfway to Ainsley's position when I ran into one of his tripwires. The wire itself didn't hurt. It was just fishing line stretched between 2 trees. But it was connected to something that made a loud metallic clang when I hit it, like a bell or piece of pipe being struck. "Found you!" Brennan's voice came from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back, just sprinted toward Ainsley's holding area as fast as I could. The chain-link fencing was about 8 feet high and topped with razor wire, but the gate was secured with just a simple padlock. "Ainsley, move away from the gate," I shouted. I fired the flare gun at point-blank range into the padlock. The flare exploded in a shower of sparks and molten metal, and when the smoke cleared, the lock was destroyed. Ainsley stumbled out of the enclosure, her hands still bound with rope. "Thank God," she sobbed. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," I said, using Brennan's camping knife to cut her bonds. "But we need to move. Now." Behind us, I could hear Brennan crashing through the burning compound, getting closer. The entire area was an inferno now, with flames reaching 50 feet into the air and smoke so thick it was hard to breathe. "Which way?" Ainsley asked. That was the crucial question. We were surrounded by fire on 3 sides, and Brennan was somewhere in the smoke behind us. The only clear escape route led deeper into the forest, away from any possible help. But as I stood there trying to decide, I heard something that changed everything. Helicopter rotors. The sound was still distant, but it was definitely getting closer. Someone had seen the fire or the flare, and help was on the way. "This way," I said, grabbing Ainsley's hand and leading her toward the sound. We ran through the forest as fast as the darkness would allow, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over obstacles. Behind us, the fire continued to spread, and I could hear Brennan shouting something, but his words were lost in the roar of flames and helicopter rotors. After about 10 minutes of hard running, we broke through the tree line into a natural clearing where the helicopter could land. The aircraft was a Coast Guard rescue chopper, probably responding to reports of the fire. As the helicopter touched down, I saw Supervisor Chen and 2 state police officers jump out. Chen spotted me immediately and ran over. "Kestrel, what the hell happened out there?" "Cade Brennan," I gasped, still out of breath from running. "He's been hunting people, killing them. He's got a compound back there, but it's burning now." Chen's expression went from relief to horror as I quickly explained what had happened. The state police officers immediately began coordinating with the helicopter crew to set up a perimeter around the fire area. "We need to get you both to a hospital," Chen said, examining Ainsley for injuries. "And then you need to tell us everything." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying us away from the burning forest, I looked back at the orange glow that marked the location of Brennan's compound. Somewhere in that inferno, a monster was either dead or planning his next hunt, but for now, Ainsley and I were alive, and that would have to be enough. The investigation that followed lasted 3 months. Search teams found the remains of Brennan's compound and recovered evidence of at least 8 victims over a 4-year period. They also found a tunnel system that Brennan had used to escape the fire, along with supply caches scattered throughout the park. But they never found Brennan himself. The official report concluded that he had probably died in the fire, but his body was never recovered. His personnel file revealed a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior during his final years as a park ranger, including multiple complaints about harassment and several instances of falsified reports. Ainsley recovered fully from her physical injuries, Though the psychological trauma took longer to heal, she changed her major from photography to criminal justice and now works as a victim's advocate for the state police. As for me, I stayed on as a park ranger, though I transferred to a different section of Olympic National Park. I couldn't bring myself to work the Hoh River area anymore. Every shadow looked like a potential threat. Every unexplained sound made me reach for my radio, but I also learned something important during those terrible hours in the forest. Sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one with claws and fangs, but the one with human intelligence and the patience to plan. The wilderness is vast and beautiful and full of wonders, but it's also the perfect place for someone to disappear, either by choice or by force. 6 months after the incident, I was patrolling a remote section of the park when I found something that made my blood run cold. Fresh boot prints in the mud beside a stream with a distinctive tread pattern I remembered from Brennan's tactical boots. I called it in immediately and search teams combed the area for 3 days. They found nothing. No camps, no equipment, no further tracks. The official explanation was that I'd made a mistake. That stress and trauma had made me see patterns that weren't really there. But I know what I saw, and late at night, when I'm alone in my patrol vehicle on some remote park road, I sometimes catch myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary, watching for headlights that might be following too closely. Because the truth is, Cade Brennan understood something fundamental about the wilderness that most people never realize. It's not the bears or the wolves or the mountain lions you need to worry about. It's the predator that walks upright, thinks strategically, and has learned to use the very vastness and beauty of the wild places as a hunting ground. And somewhere out there, in the deep forests and hidden valleys of the Olympic Peninsula, I believe he's still hunting. My name is Marlo Kestrel, and I'm 27 years old now. I've been a park ranger for 20 months, and I've learned that sometimes the most important part of protecting the wilderness is protecting people from each other. The forest remembers everything, but it doesn't always give up its secrets. And on the darkest nights when the fog rolls in from the Pacific and the ancient trees creak in the wind, I listen carefully to every sound, because I know he's still out there, waiting, hunting, and one day when I least expect it, the game will begin again. My name is Kestrel Thorne, and I am 24 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 months. This happened during the fall of 2023, when the missing person case of Indy Volkov turned into something that still haunts me. I was still new to the job, only 8 months in, when the call came through on a Tuesday morning that would change everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and the monsters that hide within it. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m. as I finished my first cup of coffee in the ranger station. Unit 12, we have a missing person report. 19-year-old female, last seen at Sol Duke Trailhead yesterday afternoon. I grabbed my notepad, trying to project the confidence I didn't feel. 8 months wasn't enough time to handle a missing person case alone, but my supervisor, Ranger Martinez, was dealing with a medical emergency on the coastal side of the park. I was it. Copy that, dispatch. Details? Indy Volkov, University of Washington student. Solo backpacking trip, planned 3 days on the Sol Duke River Trail. Roommate expected her back last night. Vehicle still in parking area. Solo backpacking. Red flag number 1. I'd read enough case files to know that Olympic's dense temperate rainforest could swallow experienced hikers, let alone college students who might have underestimated the terrain. The park's 922,000 acres included some of the most remote wilderness in the lower 48, where ancient Douglas firs created a canopy so thick that even midday felt like dusk. I drove the winding road to Sol Duke, watching the familiar landscape of moss-draped trees and rushing water. October in Olympic meant early darkness. Sunset would come before 6 p.m., and the autumn rains had already begun, turning the forest floor into a treacherous mix of mud and decomposing leaves. The smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation filled my truck as I rolled down the windows, breathing in the damp air that always made me feel simultaneously alive and uneasy. At the trailhead, I found Indy's car, a beat-up Honda Civic with University of Washington stickers and climbing gear visible through the back window. The vehicle registration confirmed what dispatch had told me. Indy Volkov, 19, studying environmental science. A small photo tucked into her sun visor showed a slight girl with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing climbing gear and grinning at the camera from what looked like Mount Rainier. Her backpack was gone, but she'd left a detailed itinerary on her dashboard, something that immediately marked her as more prepared than I'd initially assumed. The route she'd planned was ambitious. Sol Duque River Trail to Seven Lakes Basin, then north toward Bogachiel Peak before looping back. 37 miles over 3 days. Challenging but doable for someone in good shape. I shouldered my pack, checking my equipment with the methodical precision they'd drilled into us during training. GPS unit, radio, first aid kit, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, high-energy food, headlamp, backup flashlight, multi-tool, rope, and my service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock that I'd fired plenty of times at the range but never drawn in the field. The Sol Duque River Trail started easy enough, winding through old-growth forest alongside the rushing river. I moved quickly, eyes scanning for any sign of Indy's passage. The problem with Olympics trails was that the constant moisture and thick undergrowth made tracking difficult. Footprints disappeared into mud, broken branches could be attributed to elk or bear, and the dense canopy muffled sound in ways that played tricks on your ears. 3 miles in, I found my first real clue. A torn piece of blue fabric caught on a Douglas fir branch about shoulder height. The fabric was fresh, bright blue that matched the color of the jacket Indy had been wearing according to her roommate's description. I photographed it with my phone and carefully placed it in an evidence bag, marking the GPS coordinates. The trail began to climb more steeply after the fabric find, switching back through dense stands of western hemlock and Sitka spruce. The canopy grew thicker, blocking out more sunlight and creating an almost perpetual twilight. I could hear the river below, but the sound seemed distant and muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing the noise. My radio crackled with static. Unit 12, status report. I keyed the mic. Found some fabric evidence at mile marker 3. Continuing search pattern toward Seven Lakes Basin. Copy. Be advised, Weather Service is calling for heavy rain and fog moving in after 4 p.m. Consider return time. I checked my watch. 11:30 a.m. Plenty of time, I told myself, though the growing gloom made it feel much later. The autumn air carried a bite that penetrated my uniform jacket, and I could smell the approaching weather, that metallic scent that preceded Pacific Northwest storms. Another mile brought me to a small clearing where someone had obviously camped recently. The fire ring showed fresh ash, and the grass was flattened in a rectangular pattern that suggested a tent, but something felt wrong about the site. The fire had been built too large for a solo camper, and there were boot prints in the mud that looked significantly larger than what a 5'4" college student would make. I knelt beside the prints, trying to recall my tracking training. Size 11 or 12 boots. Deep tread pattern suggesting hiking boots rather than trail runners. The stride length indicated someone tall, probably male. Had Indy met another hiker? Or was this an unrelated campsite? My radio squawked again, but this time it was pure static. I tried to respond to dispatch, but got nothing but white noise in return. The dense forest often interfered with radio signals, but the timing felt ominous. I made a note to try again from higher ground. The trail continued climbing, and I pushed my pace, driven by a growing sense that time was running out. The fabric evidence and the oversized boot prints had shifted this from a routine search to something that felt more urgent. In my 8 months on the job, I'd handled 3 missing person cases, all of them resolved quickly with embarrassed but unharmed hikers who'd simply gotten turned around or delayed. This felt different. The path branched at mile marker 6, with the main trail continuing toward Seven Lakes Basin, and a fainter trail splitting off toward Bogachiel Peak. According to Indy's itinerary, she should have taken the main trail, but I noticed fresh disturbance on the smaller path, broken ferns and disturbed soil that looked recent. I faced my first real decision as a solo searcher: follow the planned route or trust my instincts about the disturbed vegetation. My training said stick to the known plan, but something about the broken ferns drew my attention. They weren't randomly damaged. They looked deliberately pushed aside as if someone wanted to conceal passage down the smaller trail. I chose the smaller path. The trail immediately became more primitive, little more than a game path winding through increasingly dense forest. Old-growth cedars rose like cathedral pillars around me, their massive trunks disappearing into the canopy overhead. The air grew thick with moisture and the rich smell of decomposition, not the clean decay of autumn leaves, but something heavier and more cloying. 20 minutes down the side trail, I found Indy's water bottle. It was lying in the middle of the path, a bright orange Nalgene bottle that stood out like a beacon against the brown forest floor. I photographed it before picking it up, noting that it was still half full and showed no signs of damage. Someone had simply dropped it or set it down, but the location bothered me. The bottle was positioned too perfectly in the center of the path, as if it had been deliberately placed rather than accidentally dropped. A breadcrumb for someone to follow. My hands started to shake as I bagged the evidence, and I realized I was breathing faster than the gentle climb warranted. Something primal in my hindbrain was screaming danger, even though I couldn't articulate why. The forest felt too quiet. No bird calls, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth, just the distant whisper of wind in the canopy and my own labored breathing. I tried my radio again. Nothing but static. The trail continued downhill toward what my map showed as Bogachil Creek, a smaller waterway that eventually fed into the Solduc River. The vegetation grew even denser, creating a tunnel effect that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. I clicked on my headlamp even though it was only 2 p.m. That's when I heard the first scream. It was definitely human, definitely female, and it came from somewhere ahead and below me on the trail. High-pitched and terrified, lasting about 3 seconds before cutting off abruptly. The sound seemed to echo in the dense forest, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact direction. I broke into a run, crashing through the undergrowth with none of the stealth my training had emphasized. Branches whipped at my face and my pack bounced awkwardly on my shoulders as I stumbled down the increasingly steep trail. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth. The trail leveled out near the creek, and I could hear running water ahead through the trees. I slowed my approach, trying to control my breathing and listen for any additional sounds. The scream had definitely come from this direction, but now the forest had returned to its unnatural silence. I smelled the campfire before I saw it. The scent of burning wood mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach clench. I approached carefully, drawing my weapon for the first time in my career. The Glock felt heavy and unfamiliar in my hands despite hundreds of hours of training. The campsite was in a small clearing beside Bogachil Creek, sheltered by massive cedar trees that formed natural walls on 3 sides. A fire burned in a stone ring, sending smoke curling up into the canopy. A military-style tent was pitched nearby, along with what looked like professional camping equipment, too much gear for a solo backpacker. And tied to a tree at the far edge of the clearing was Indy Volkov. She was alive but barely conscious, slumped against her restraints with her head hanging forward. Her blue jacket was torn and dirty, and there were visible bruises on her arms and face. She'd been gagged with what looked like duct tape, and her wrists were bound behind the tree with climbing rope. I should have approached immediately, should have freed her and called for backup. Instead, I hesitated at the edge of the tree line, some instinct warning me that this scene was wrong in ways I couldn't yet understand. The campsite was too organized, too permanent. This wasn't the rough camp of someone who'd stumbled across a lone hiker. This was established, planned, prepared. The fire had been burning for hours, and there was a cooking setup that suggested someone intended to stay for days. Well, well. You found my little breadcrumb trail. The voice came from directly behind me, calm and conversational as if we'd just met at a coffee shop. I spun around, raising my weapon, and found myself face to face with a man I recognized from training photos. Garrett Blackwood, former Olympic National Park Ranger dismissed 18 months ago for conduct unbecoming after multiple complaints about his treatment of female hikers. 6'2", broad shoulders, graying beard, and eyes that held no warmth despite his casual smile. "Easy there, rookie," he said, making no move toward the rifle slung across his shoulder. "No need to get excited, we're just having a conversation." My hands trembled as I kept the Glock trained on his chest. "Step back, Garrett. Step back and get on the ground." He laughed, a sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. You know who I am. Good. That saves us some time. He glanced toward the clearing where Indy remained tied to the tree. She's fine, by the way. Scared but unharmed. For now. Let her go. Oh, I will. Eventually. But first, you and I are going to play a little game. The way he said it made my blood run cold. This wasn't a random encounter or a hostage situation I could negotiate my way through. This was planned, orchestrated, designed. You see, Kestrel, and yes, I know your name, I know all about you. I've been watching the Park Service for months, waiting for the right opportunity. Solo ranger, missing person case, remote location. You checked all the boxes. I tried to key my radio with my left hand while keeping the gun trained on him with my right, but he noticed the movement and shook his head. Radio's not going to work down here, rookie. Too much interference from the geography. And even if it did, help is hours away. It's just you, me, and little Indy over there. What do you want? I want to hunt, he said simply. Real hunting, not deer or elk or bear, but something that can think, something that can plan, something that can be truly afraid. His eyes glittered with an enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. The Park Service took away my badge, my authority, my purpose, so I made my own purpose. Understanding hit me like a physical blow. Indy wasn't just a kidnapping victim, she was bait. The whole thing had been designed to lure a ranger into the woods, into Garrett's territory where he held every advantage. I know these woods better than anyone, he continued as if reading my thoughts. 42 years old, 20 years as a ranger before they forced me out. I know every trail, every creek, every cave and hiding spot in a 50-mile radius. I know where the radio dead zones are, where the GPS satellites can't penetrate the canopy, where a person could disappear forever. I fought to keep my voice steady. You're going to prison, Garrett. This ends here, does it? He tilted his head, studying me with the patient interest of a predator sizing up prey. You're 8 months out of training, Kestrel. 8 months of guided tours and minor citations, and lost hikers who wandered 50 yards off trail. You've never drawn your weapon outside the range, never tracked a human being, never had to make a life or death decision when no one else was coming to help. Everything he said was true, and my confidence crumbled a little more with each word. Here's the game, he said. I'm going to give you a 5-minute head start to run. Take the girl if you want, she'll slow you down, but it's your choice. I'll follow, and when I catch you... He shrugged. Well, I think you can imagine what happens then. I'm not playing your game. Yes, you are, because if you don't, I'll kill her right now while you watch, and then I'll still hunt you. At least this way, she has a chance. I looked toward Indy, who had raised her head and was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She was trying to say something through the gag, probably begging me not to leave her. The smart move would be to shoot Garrett where he stood. But he was still 10 feet away, and despite my range training, I'd never fired at a human being. My hands were shaking, and he was armed with what looked like a high-powered hunting rifle. If I missed or if the shot wasn't immediately fatal, he could kill both Indy and me before I could fire again. 5 minutes, he repeated. Starting now. I made the stupidest decision of my life. I ran. I sprinted toward the tree where Indy was tied, fumbling for my multi-tool as Garrett's laughter followed me across the clearing. The rope around her wrists was climbing grade nylon, and my knife blade felt pathetically small as I sawed at the restraints. Come on, I muttered, glancing over my shoulder to see Garrett standing calmly by the fire, checking his watch. The rope parted just as he called out, 4 minutes, ladies. I pulled the gag from Indy's mouth and she immediately started sobbing. He's been keeping me here for 2 days, she gasped. He said he was waiting for someone to come looking. Can you run? She nodded, though I could see her legs shaking as I helped her to her feet. We stumbled toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing, away from the trail I'd used to approach. 3 minutes, Garrett called cheerfully. The forest on this side of the creek was even denser, with no established trail and undergrowth that clawed at our clothes and skin. I tried to move quietly, but Indy was crashing through the brush like a wounded animal, breathing hard and whimpering with each step. We splashed across Bogachil Creek, the ice-cold water shocking my system and soaking through my boots. On the far side, I pulled Indy behind a massive fallen cedar and tried to think. My training had covered search and rescue, basic first aid, and law enforcement procedures. Nothing about being hunted by a former colleague who knew the terrain better than I knew my own apartment. My GPS unit showed our location, but the dense canopy made satellite reception spotty, and I didn't trust it to guide us to safety. 2 minutes, Garrett's voice echoed through the trees, somehow seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "What do we do?" Indy whispered. I had no idea. The ranger station was at least 8 miles away through difficult terrain, and Garrett would catch us long before we reached help. My radio was useless, my GPS was unreliable, and I was responsible for the life of a terrified college student who could barely walk, let alone run. 1 minute. I made another decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of running farther into the forest, I led Indy in a wide circle back toward the creek, moving parallel to the water but staying in the dense trees. If Garrett expected us to flee in a straight line away from his camp, maybe we could throw him off by doubling back. The sound of the creek masked our movement, and I felt a brief flicker of hope as we made our way downstream. Maybe I could outthink him, use his expectations against him. That hope died when we heard his voice, much closer than it should have been. "Time's up, ladies. Let the hunt begin." The voice came from directly ahead of us, even though we'd been moving away from his camp. Somehow he'd anticipated our route and positioned himself to intercept us. I pushed Indy down behind a cluster of ferns and raised my weapon, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest was completely silent except for the sound of running water and our own labored breathing. "I can smell your fear," Garrett called out, his voice seeming to echo from everywhere and nowhere. "Adrenaline has a very distinctive scent, you know, sweet and sharp and absolutely unmistakable." A branch snapped to our left, and I swung the Glock toward the sound. Nothing but shadows and moss-covered trees. "You're thinking like prey," his voice continued, now coming from a different direction. "Running, hiding, hoping someone will save you. But nobody's coming, Kestrel. It's just you and me and the woods." Another sound, this time behind us. I spun around, trying to cover all directions at once while keeping Indy protected. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst, and the metallic taste in my mouth had grown stronger. "Here's what's going to happen," Garrett said, and this time his voice was definitely closer. "I'm going to take my time with this. Hunt you slowly, let the fear build. You'll make mistakes when you're scared. Forget your training, abandon your equipment, leave tracks a blind man could follow." I saw him then, just a glimpse of movement between the trees about 50 yards to our right. He was moving parallel to our position, staying just visible enough to let us know he was there. "He's hurting us," I whispered to Indy, "driving us where he wants us to go." But where? And why not just shoot us from a distance with that rifle? The answer came to me with horrible clarity. He was enjoying this. The hunt was the point, not the kill. He wanted us scared, wanted us to run and hide and suffer before the end. This was entertainment for him. I tried to think tactically, to remember my training about dealing with armed suspects, but the academy had never covered being hunted through dense forest by someone who knew the terrain better than you did. This was survival, pure and simple. "Move," I whispered to Indy. "Stay low, follow the creek bank." We started moving again, hunched over and trying to use the undergrowth for cover. The creek curved to the left ahead, and I hoped we might find better terrain or another crossing point. That's when I stepped into the snare. My right foot plunged through what looked like solid ground, and suddenly I was hanging upside down from a tree branch, my ankle caught in a loop of climbing rope that had been concealed under a layer of leaves and moss. Indy screamed as I swung helplessly, my weapon falling from my hands and disappearing into the ferns below. Blood rushed to my head, and my pack shifted awkwardly on my shoulders, throwing off my balance as I spun slowly in the air. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" Garrett emerged from behind a nearby tree, no longer bothering to conceal himself. Classic snare design, adapted for larger prey. I set up about a dozen of these along the most likely escape routes. I twisted frantically, trying to reach the rope around my ankle, but the angle was impossible. My head pounded from the blood flow, and I could feel panic setting in as I realized how completely helpless I was. "Please," Indy said, backing away from Garrett as he approached. "Please don't hurt us." "Oh, I'm not going to hurt you, sweetheart," he said with that horrible smile. "I'm going to kill you, both of you. But not quickly. The fear is half the fun." He raised his rifle, and I thought this was it, hanging like a piece of meat while he executed us both. Instead, he fired into the air, the crack of the gunshot echoing through the forest like thunder. "Just want to make sure there are no other rangers in the area," he explained. "Can't have unexpected visitors interrupting our fun." My vision was starting to blur from hanging upside down, and I could feel my strength ebbing. But I forced myself to keep thinking, to look for any advantage or opportunity. That's when I noticed my multi-tool had fallen from my belt and was lying on the ground about 2 feet away. If I could swing myself over, I started rocking back and forth, using my body weight to build momentum. Garrett watched with amusement, making no move to stop me. "Go ahead," he said. "Struggle all you want. It's more entertaining this way." My fingertips brushed the multi-tool on the 3rd swing, and I managed to grab it on the 4th. The knife blade was still extended from when I'd cut Indy's ropes, and I immediately started sawing at the rope around my ankle. "Smart girl," Garrett observed. "But even if you get down, where are you going to go? I know these woods, Kestrel. Every trail, every hiding spot, every way out. You're mice in a maze, and I designed the maze." The rope parted just as he finished speaking, and I crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and equipment. Pain shot through my shoulder where I'd landed wrong, but I forced myself to roll and grab for my fallen weapon. Garrett's boot came down on my wrist before I could reach the Glock. Ah, he said, applying just enough pressure to make me gasp. "Can't have you shooting me now, can we?" He kicked the gun away and stepped back, gesturing for me to stand. My ankle throbbed where the snare had dug in, and my shoulder felt like it might be dislocated, but I struggled to my feet anyway. "Much better," he said. "Now we can have a proper conversation." Indy was pressed against a tree about 10 feet away, tears streaming down her face. I caught her eye and tried to project more confidence than I felt, hoping she wouldn't do anything to provoke him. "You know," Garrett continued, "I always wondered what it would be like to hunt Park Service personnel, whether your training would make you more challenging prey or just give you false confidence. The answer's false confidence, in case you're wondering," he added with that horrible smile. I was trying to spot my weapon in the undergrowth when I heard something that made my heart leap. The distant sound of helicopter rotors. Garrett heard it too, and his expression darkened. "Shit. Someone must have noticed you were overdue." The sound was definitely getting closer, and I felt a surge of hope. If I could just keep him talking until the helicopter arrived. "Don't get your hopes up," Garrett said, as if reading my thoughts. "They'll never find us under this canopy, and even if they did, well..." He raised his rifle meaningfully, but something had changed in his demeanor. The patient predator was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly felt pressed for time. That made him more dangerous, but it also made him more likely to make mistakes. "Change of plans," he said abruptly. "I was going to drag this out, really savor the experience. But it looks like we need to accelerate the timeline." He swung the rifle toward Indy, and I knew I had perhaps 2 seconds before he pulled the trigger. I threw my multi-tool at his head. It wasn't a good throw. My shoulder was injured, and the angle was awkward, but it was unexpected enough to make him flinch and shift his aim. Instead of hitting Indy center mass, the bullet splintered bark from the tree beside her. I launched myself at him while he was still recovering from the missed shot, tackling him around the waist and driving him backward into the creek. We hit the water in a tangle of limbs, the shock of the cold water momentarily stunning us both. Garrett was bigger and stronger, but I had desperation on my side. I clawed at his face, trying to get control of the rifle while he attempted to throw me off. The creek bottom was slippery with moss and rounded stones, making it impossible to get solid footing. He managed to get his hands around my throat, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as his thumbs pressed into my windpipe. I flailed wildly, trying to break his grip, but he was too strong. That's when Indy hit him with a rock. She'd crept up behind us while we struggled in the water, and she brought a softball-sized stone down on the back of Garrett's head with everything she had. His grip on my throat loosened, and I gasped air into my burning lungs. "Run!" I croaked, pushing Indy away from the creek. "Find the helicopter." But Garrett wasn't finished. Blood streamed from the gash on his scalp, but he was already getting to his feet, reaching for the rifle that had fallen into the shallow water. I threw myself on the weapon, trying to wrestle it away from him, but my injured shoulder made me clumsy. He managed to reverse our positions, pinning me under the rifle barrel across my throat. "You little bitch," he snarled, blood dripping from his head wound onto my face. "I was going to make this quick, but now you're going to suffer." The helicopter sound was definitely closer now, and I could hear voices calling through the trees. Search and rescue was finally here, but they were still too far away. Garrett increased the pressure on my throat, and I felt consciousness starting to slip away. My vision tunneled, and the sounds of the forest began to fade. Then I remembered the flare gun in my pack. My emergency kit included a small flare pistol for signaling aircraft, and I'd landed hard enough on my pack to shift the contents around. I could feel the plastic grip pressing against my back through the fabric. With the last of my strength, I reached behind myself and fumbled for the pack's side pocket. Garrett was so focused on choking me that he didn't notice my hand moving until I had the flare gun out and pressed against his ribs. "What the—" I pulled the trigger. The flare punched through his jacket and ignited, burning at 2,000 degrees and filling the air with red smoke and the smell of burning flesh. Garrett screamed and rolled away from me, clutching his side where the flare had struck. I gasped for air, my throat feeling like I'd swallowed broken glass, but I forced myself to move. The rifle was lying in the creek, and I grabbed it with shaking hands just as Garrett tried to get back to his feet. "Don't move," I croaked, though I could barely speak. He looked at me with pure hatred, one hand pressed against the burning hole in his side. "You think this is over? You think they'll find all the bodies I've buried out here?" The helicopter was directly overhead now, rotors thundering through the canopy. I could hear rappelling equipment being deployed and voices shouting coordinates. "There are others," Garrett continued, his voice getting weaker as shock set in. 7 over the past 18 months, hikers who disappeared without a trace. Their families are still waiting for them to come home. I kept the rifle trained on him as the first search and rescue personnel crashed through the undergrowth. Within minutes, the creek bank was full of people. Paramedics, rangers, county sheriff's deputies, all moving with the efficient urgency of professionals who knew their job. They loaded Garrett onto a stretcher, the flare wound dressed but still smoking faintly. As they carried him away, he looked directly at me. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "There are others like me out there. Others who understand that the real predators walk on 2 legs. I never saw him again. He died from his injuries during the helicopter flight to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, taking the locations of his other victims with him. The FBI found evidence of at least 5 additional murders in his cache of supplies, but the bodies were never recovered. Indy recovered physically from her ordeal, though she transferred schools and never returned to Washington State. She sends me a card every year on the anniversary, thanking me for saving her life. I don't feel like I saved anyone. I feel like I barely survived my own stupidity and inexperience. I stayed with the Park Service for another 6 months before transferring to a desk job with the Forest Service. I told myself it was because I wanted to focus on policy and planning, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't handle being alone in the wilderness anymore, because Garrett was right about one thing. The most dangerous predator in any forest walks upright and thinks like we do. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of the longest nights, I wonder how many others are out there, waiting patiently in the places where civilization ends and the ancient rules of hunter and prey still apply. The Olympic National Park covers nearly 1 million acres of temperate rainforest, alpine peaks, and rugged coastline. Every year, hundreds of thousands of visitors explore its trails, camp in its wilderness, and trust in its beauty and solitude. Most of them make it home safely, but not all of them. And in the deepest parts of the forest, where the canopy blocks out the sun and the silence is broken only by the sound of wind and water, Something is always hunting,